Hi, and welcome back. Phase shift is a scary concept. It's invisible, often inaudible, and yet apparently capable of ruining our mixes in ways we're not even aware of. But as is often the case, when you take the time to understand it properly, it ceases to be scary at all. While there are potential pitfalls, they're smaller than you might think, and easy to avoid when you know exactly where they are. Here are some truisms you may have heard. EQ causes phase shift, unless it's linear phase EQ. Yes, this is true. Phase shift can cause cancellation when mixed with the original unphase shifted signal. Also true, although note it says can, not will. Therefore, you shouldn't EQ parallel channels or you'll get weird, unexpected results. Not true at all. I've even seen this concept taken further. Multi-mic arrays, such as a drum kit setup with close mics, overheads and room mics, will have a high degree of correlation between channels, so arguably EQing individual channels becomes a form of parallel EQ. I've heard some people argue that, therefore, you need to use linear phase EQ for your drum mics to avoid messing everything up with phase shift. Honestly, to someone like me who's mixed literally hundreds of drum kits using analog EQs, the above statement just seems laughable. Likewise, if you pause to reflect on the many awesome drum sounds recorded and mixed on analog consoles in the 70s and 80s, when no one had ever heard of linear phase EQ. But given those first two truisms that I endorsed above, you might reasonably wonder, why isn't phase shift a problem when EQing drums? Let's start by analysing the phase shift from an EQ. I'm using Pro Q3 because it's my standard go-to, and it conveniently allows me to switch between linear phase and minimum phase modes without changing the EQ curve. But what I'm about to show you will apply to any minimum phase EQ. I'll start with a high-pass filter. Note that the phase is still pretty flat at the high end, the pass band as it's called, but starts to change significantly near the cutoff, and changes wildly below it. When the phase shift reaches 180 degrees at the top of the graph, it wraps around to the bottom again, as it starts to come back round the other side of the phase circle. So this vertical line shows the point at which the phase is completely reversed. If mixed with the dry signal, this will indeed result in cancellation, as in my truism above. And with the correct relative gain settings, you would get perfect cancellation and a deep notch at this frequency as a result. Okay, but that's a high-pass filter. I was talking about EQ, by which I mean bell and shelf filters. They cause phase shift too, right? What's the difference? Well, quite a lot, as it happens. Here's a mid-boost. I've been quite heavy-handed. 18 dB of boost represents more than you'll normally use in most cases, right? Now look at the phase shift. There are two important things to notice. First of all, it's really insignificant compared to the high-pass filter we just looked at. We're not getting close to 180 degrees of phase shift anywhere, which means that there's no possible gain setting at which mixing this with the dry signal will result in a notch filter. The other thing to notice about the phase shift, there isn't any at the target frequency. The frequency that I'm actually boosting remains at zero phase, while the phase shift is all above and below that frequency. In fact, the phase shift is related to the gradient of the frequency response graph, rather than the amount of boost or cut, and the frequency I'm targeting will remain at zero phase regardless of my other settings. So what happens when you run this in parallel with the dry signal? Let's start with the EQ flat. Obviously, mixing this with the dry signal at unity would give us a 6 dB boost, so I've compensated by turning both dry and wet signals down by 6 dB, so we start with a flat line at unity. And let's add 6 dB of boost at 500 Hz. And what have we got overall? It's less than 6 dB of boost, as we've only EQ'd half the signal path. But it is, however, boosting 500 Hz, and it's doing so with a perfectly conventional and uncontroversial bell shape. So what happened to the phase shift? Well, I can show you. Let's save this plot as a reference, then switch to linear phase mode, and then bear with me for a second while I tell MetaPlugin to recalculate the latency. And now we see the perfect version without the phase shift. We've got a slightly wider bell. That's it. It doesn't even change the amount of boost. In case you're wondering, it works the same for an EQ cut. With a linear phase parallel EQ, the cut ends up a little bit wider with the same settings, but otherwise there's no difference. If you're thinking, well, I set the Q value purely by ear anyway, so using a minimum phase EQ instead of linear phase just means I'll end up with a slightly different Q setting. Then I'm in total agreement with you. Alrighty, what about shelves? Let's first of all have a look at the phase response of a shelf filter on its own. And like with the bell-shaped band, phase shift depends on the gradient, not the amount of boost or cut. The flat pass band below the cutoff trends back to zero phase, and so does the flat part of the shelf. The phase shift all happens in the transition band, where there's a slope in the frequency response. Notice also that, no matter how much boost or cut I dial in, that phase shift never reaches 180 degrees, where it could potentially cause complete cancellation. So what does this do in parallel? Here's a 6 dB boost, with the EQ in linear phase mode, so without the phase shift. Again, we get less than 6 dB boost overall, but it's still a shelf at the frequency we specified. Let's save this plot and see how it changes in minimum phase mode. And this time our shelf has simply shifted a bit higher. No more or less boost, no weird nasty surprises anywhere. It's just a very slightly higher shelf than it was. Let's try a low shelf. Here it is in linear phase mode, and here in minimum phase. This time the shelf is a tiny bit lower. If you're thinking, this difference is probably too small to matter, and if it isn't, I'm going to tune it out by ear anyway. I'm once again in total agreement. Now, I'm not suggesting you bus your signals out to parallel EQs in the same way you might a compressor, precisely because a parallel EQ doesn't profoundly change its behaviour like a parallel compressor does. Most of the time it's easier to EQ your signals on the channels, and running just an EQ in parallel will merely complicate things needlessly to no benefit. But if you've already got a parallel compressor channel running, go ahead and EQ that channel to your heart's desire. The dynamics processing will make the EQ you're applying subtly dynamic, as it will become more significant whenever the compressor gain rides up. But there will be no other unexpected consequences, no nasty surprises, no humiliating moments where the mastering engineer says, "OMG, you didn't use a parallel EQ, did you?" Because a shelf will just give you a shelf, and a bell will just give you a bell, and if you're not doing it, you're missing out. Now, of course, I need to circle back to the start and remind you that high-pass or low-pass filters introduce way more phase shift and can potentially get you into trouble. They're often thought of as a purer, simpler way to control the low and high extremes, and therefore preferable to shelving cuts. But that's definitely not the case in parallel. And by the way, you do also need to be careful with those filters when dealing with a multi-mic drum recording. So am I telling you to avoid using filters in parallel? Hell no. Some of my favourite mixing tricks rely on it. What I'm actually saying is, make sure you're subbed to the channel so you don't miss my parallel filter tricks video when I finally get around to making it. Thanks for watching.